Hello, welcome again to another podcast with Law Matters. I am attorney Shawn Smith, and so excited to have you back here to listen to this episode. It is going to be a very interesting and could be controversial episode as we talk about CRT, better known as critical race theory. And to join me in this conversation, I have one of my good friends by the name of Camara Williams. Welcome to the podcast, Camara.
What's going on, Shawn? Man, I'm excited. You know, this is a very fun subject.
yes. Especially in this day and time, right?
I mean, it's a fun subject, period. It's just now it's a lot more explosive because of the politics behind it.
Yes, politics has definitely played a role in it becoming so popular nowadays. And to be honest, one of the reasons why I have you on, because my wife, I think, was on Facebook and she saw one of the posts that you mentioned and she sent it to me. I was like, I know Camara, I'm going to have him come on. So tell us a little bit about your background and what do you know about CRT?
Well, first of all, I didn't know I was Facebook friends with your wife. So you know. So,
you got to figure that part out.
I got to figure that part out. No, because people do that. Be like, oh, I saw you on Facebook. And I'm like, we're Facebook friends? Okay. So my name is attorney Camara Williams. I am based out of Orlando, Florida. I practice in the area of probate, litigation, guardianship, and estate planning. I have a master's and a bachelor's in history, primarily in African American history and Black history, focused on Black history. And obviously I have a law degree. And just my experience with critical race theory is having taken an elective in law school and graduate study work, having a class and about the concept of critical race theory. So, but I want to offer the disclaimer, I am not an expert in critical race theory. It is a subject in a very niche elective of evaluation of race and law and society, and we can get into the definition behind that, but just want to give that disclaimer to everybody to be like thinking, you have an expert on there, and I'm like, I am not an expert.
In fact, you have your own podcast where you also talked about critical race theory, so go ahead and give a plug for that as well.
Appreciate it. Yeah, man. Podcast Uncultured Bias with Camara Williams. You can find it on Apple and Spotify and my website at CamaraWilliams.com. So we literally just had a podcast on there with Dr. Terrence Kidd and attorney Lyndon Carter. Dr. Terrence Kidd specifically is director of critical race theory at Southern University, among being vice chancellor of academic studies at Southern University. So, which is located in Louisiana. So very expansive. We talked about a number of different subjects surrounding critical race theory and the concepts of just history and everything going along with that.
So let's start off with the basics.
Yeah.
What is critical race theory?
That's a very short question to a long form answer, right? So, but in the most basic terms is critical race theory is evaluation of law and society and economics and how it intersects with one another, right? So it's a very niche subject that is generally evaluated either in graduate level studies or in particular law electives. And for those who need a background on that, critical race theory was actually developed in the 1970s.
Yeah. I wanted to go there. Who started it? How did it come to fruition?
It started from scholars Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado. Now, those names are important, but they were inspired by Thurgood Marshall, and specifically in Brown versus Board of Education. Now, for those who are familiar, maybe unfamiliar, let's just walk it back to some highlights in that case. Thurgood Marshall, before he got on the Supreme Court, argued a case called Brown versus Board of Education, where he was arguing against segregation and the concept of separate but equal. Now, what he took in that is where he used dolls as it's called, the doll case study.
Yes.
And so he showed how the interrelation of dolls and how Black kids saw themselves, and then how be separated but equal has an undeniable effect on the outlook of the child. And so there's no way you can be separate but equal, because kids saw themselves in a subjugated placement because of the way society had been orchestrated.
I'm going to put a pause there, because that was deep, and I wanted to unplug that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Now, those names that you mentioned, some may not know, the names of Derek Bell and Crenshaw. What are their professions, just to make it clear? They are all what?
They're lawyers.
They were lawyers.
They're law scholars specifically, and they were inspired again, by the concept of how Thurgood Marshall evaluated or took the evaluation of law and society and interpolated in this case.
And we're going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education as well.
Yeah.
Now, these lawyers went to what schools?
Oh, now you're going to put me on the spot. I don't remember. I don't know exactly what schools they went to.
Ivy League, wasn't it Ivy League schools? Harvard?
I do believe they were Ivy League education, but I don't know. Don't quote me on that because I don't. Again, I am not an expert. I just remember they were the law scholars that actually were the originators of critical race theory.
So as lawyers, we feel kind of connected and can kind of relate in some ways, knowing that this was an analysis a lot of times done in law school and in higher education. Would you agree with that aspect?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. It's generally done, again, as a niche subject, as an elective. You've been in law school and you understand what are your core subject matters, right? And then you go ahead and take niche subjects that interest you, right? And it's something that you can elect, clear point elective, you can elect to take this subject, but it's not a core principle for you to actually be in law. But I know you have a next question, but I just want to highlight this point because it's important. The mere fact that you have to elect to take this course shows you that it's not imperative in order to actually, be a lawyer. The fact that you have to elect to take this course in your graduate studies, it shows not an imperative that you have to actually graduate in, whatever subject or discipline, academic discipline you're in. Most people who actually specialize in critical race theory are those who actually get a doctorate in that particular area of critical analysis or society or economics. And critical race, it just happens to be one of the subjects along the way. So it's not something that people in general are going to be familiar with and not something that people are going to actually study, even, going all the way down to K through 12 studies. And I know we're going to go there, but I just wanted to make sure that was a very clear point.
Oh, thank you so very much. Because I know when I was in law school, I didn't have any I didn't take any classes.
And you wouldn't.
Critical race theory. Did you take any at your law school?
No, I did not. I didn't take a critical race theory.
Again, just shows you how small of a population are even studying or analyzing this, because one, it's mostly lawyers, and two, it's lawyers that elect take the subject or class.
Right. Now, I did take a class called Race and Law, and given by Professor Broussard, but that was not a critical race theory. And again, that's how niche that subject is, because it wasn't a specific discipline. Critical race theory is a specific discipline. And so, again, we have to make sure that everybody has been throwing around the term, critical race theory, and there's a reason behind that, because there is a very nefarious reason why they've tried to curate the understanding of critical race theory, or CRT as they're abbreviating it to.
Now, and I didn't know this before, but you said Bell and others took a look at what Thurgood Marshall did in preparation for his arguments to the Supreme Court with Brown versus Board of Education.
Right.
And for those lawyers, those people who are listening who are not lawyers or just may not even be familiar with Brown versus Board of Education, basically it's a Supreme Court ruling that said that separate
but equal
is unconstitutional. Essentially, it desegregated. Yeah, desegregated pretty much everything, whether it be buses, whether it be schools, whether it be specifically schools, that, we all have to be educated together. In fact, the multicultural schools that we see now, when we do see them, is in fact a part of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, one of the things you said he did, and I think I would invite people to look at this study, is the doll study, where you had the black doll and you had the white doll. Delve into that a little bit more. And I know you mentioned it before, but what was he able to find from that study?
Right. So Thurgood Marshall used what we call critical race theory, but by showing systemic racism in a separate but equal, led only to unequal outcomes, but also inherent racial bias. Brown examined the effect of overt discrimination in segregated and unequal schools, how society perpetuated bigotry with systemic racism and internal guards against fairness. Those who wished to preserve separate but equal claimed that it wasn't discriminatory, just separate. The Dahl test showed how the practice, especially as it related to fundamental socialization, contributed to the perpetuation of racism in social systems. Fundamentally, though, the discrimination springs from different concept of racism. Critical race theory puts that emphasis on the outcomes and not merely on the individual's own beliefs, which is what Thurgood Marshall was espousing in his argument.
And to make it clear, you have two daughters,
Yes.
I have a daughter, and I have also a sister. And I remember growing up, well, I think an example of that would be if we took our child to pick a doll up from, I was going to say Toys R Us, but they're no longer around, so any toy store, and we say, here, daughter or sister, here's a black doll. And in response, they're like, no, I don't want the black doll. I would rather the white doll. It was like, well, why do you not want the black doll? And the response would be, well, the white doll is better. And they're like, well, where did you get this? Where did you learn this? And that would explain, well, the black doll is not as good. The black doll is not as pretty. The black doll is not as nice. It's not something that they would learn at home, but based upon the society and culture of which we live in, that's the kind of mindset that they would leave with. Are you now indicating that critical race theory looks at that analysis and sees how race plays a role in individuals' mindsets concerning those kind of things as well?
What critical race theory really does is it just shows us to look at society not through the lens of centering on whiteness, right? But it also, and there's a key point. I'm gonna go back to that in a second, but it makes us look through the society through the prism of fairness and how whether or not if fairness is appropriate and if there's any discriminatory basis behind it. So we look at whether or not it's the loans program, redlining, right? We look at whether or not voting laws, right?
Throwing out a lot of terminologies that you and I know, but some may not know. Tell us about redlining. What is redlining?
So redlining was a concept that was created in the 1930s backed by the government, where they actually took communities and they said that only black people can only buy homes in particular areas. And those areas then tend to bring down the value of the home. Now, as it was mentioned on the podcast, on the Uncultured Bias podcast, we actually stated that this was a government-backed ideal because the government understood that they needed to build the middle class. And so they understand, and the biggest way to build a middle class was through home ownership, just like today, right? And so what they were doing is they're saying, okay, we want to make sure that loans were only given to 90% of white buyers, and then only 10% of black homeowners were able to get loans at a particular period. And if they did get loans, they were only regimented to particular areas. They couldn't just move into certain neighborhoods. Redlining, the banning of redlining was to get rid of that entire concept.
How long did that whole concept last of redlining? I mean, do we remember when it began?
I don't recall when redlining actually became outlawed. I want to say with the 1960s. I don't recall the exact case, but I know it was in front of the Warren Court. And the Warren Court, for those, is the Justice Warren Court was one of the biggest was the Supreme Court that pushed a lot of the civil rights reforms that we enjoy today.
The Warren Court also had Thurgood Marshall a part of it as well.
Right.
Now, and when you talk about redlining, how does that relate? Go ahead and tell us again how that relates to the critical race theory analysis and why they believe things like redlining were important.
Because what you're doing is now you're subjugating a particular group and making them less than as far as economics. And although it was based in law, right, redlining was a federal-backed program, it was still unjust and clearly propagated one race over another. Critical race theory would have evaluated that particular instance, although critical race theory came after the banishment of redlining, it would have evaluated that, hey, this is not fair, right? We cannot have a law that is allowing one group to accumulate wealth and access and another group that is being told that they only can live in a certain area of society. True enough, it might be a law, but just because something is law does not make it right. Okay, we understand that. So redlining would have been evaluated under CRT and evaluated to make sure it was improper, so we wouldn't have even gotten to that place in the first place.
From my understanding of critical race theory, is it looks at racism not from an individual standpoint, but from a structural standpoint. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it looks at this. It looks at society, and takes a bird's eye view or a macro view on just how society as a whole, and it points out, okay, is this fair? Is this equal? Is this equitable towards everybody?
Now, some of the critics of CRT may argue, hey, listen, we understand that during the 60s and the 50s, there was a lot of racism going on, and there may have been even laws at that time that were racist, including redlining. But nowadays, we don't have such laws are based on a racist structure. So why do we even still need to make an analysis on critical race theory if we don't have those blatant racist laws like we did before?
Well, that's actually would be inaccurate, because we look at laws today and we see how states are passing voter registration laws or voter laws that are severely impact African Americans. And so, critical race theory would evaluate the structural impact of voting as it relates to a certain group and say, is this particular act designed to create equality in the voting system, or is it designed to create a subjugated class as far as representation?
Through an analysis of CRT, kind of gave us the affirmative action you mentioned.
Right.
How did that come to fruition, where analysis of CRT?
I don't know the mechanics of how it came to, but what I'm giving you a prime example of how affirmative action would apply, and how CRT helped us have an understanding of equitable rights as far as advancement in society. And affirmative action is a prime example of that, right? So getting the job, or getting to school, right? And those who are against affirmative action will say, well, you're not evaluating somebody based on their credentials, you're evaluating based on their race. Mm-hmm. And what critical race theory would say, well, actually, no. What we're taking into consideration is that those who are normally normalized into getting the position are given an unfair advantage by just the sheer notion of their privilege, right? Or the concept of them actually, because they came from a certain learning environment, they came from a certain social club, they came from an economic stance, right? And affirmative action would make us say, okay, well, hold on, before we just start bringing people in, right? Let's evaluate how we're bringing them in. Are we taking a fair look at everybody and then combining their history and class and how we evaluate them? Because sometimes you do it, I do it, everybody do it. We incorporate bias in how we evaluate people because, you know what? They didn't go to my school. Or you know what? They don't hang with my friends. Or you know what? I don't even like their sports team. We do it all the time. We do biases all the time, mm-hmm. right? And so it's just natural. So but in this sense, bias is happening on a racial, social, economic structure.
You indicated that critical race theory just doesn't look at the black race. It looks at all races.
Right. Looking critically at race in society, not black people, not just white people, right? It's looking at race in society and how it intersects with law and economics and society. That's really what it is.
Some of the proponents also said that it fosters racism. And I'm going to tie it right into the political arguments that you're seeing now, where certain states are now outlawing critical race theory. In your conversations and discussions, is critical race theory even taught in elementary school or high school?
Unless kids are getting taught, reading books about Kimberly Crenshaw and, and having deep founded discussions on race and economics, right? That's not happening. In fact, K through 12 studies don't incorporate any form of critical race theory at any juncture. Thought of it is preposterous, right? That critical race theory is even involved on an academic level. Let's just break that down. My kids are in elementary school, or my oldest is in elementary school. I can't imagine them having deep-founded conversations surrounding law and economics and society in elementary school. Let's talk about middle school. Where in that curriculum are they incorporating law and economics? Oh, let's talk about high school. We understand that a lot of these schools have to take standardized testing, and they're very regimented in what they have to learn in order to prepare them for the test. Where in that regimented curriculum are they learning about law and society and economics. Where? It's not happening. What is actually happening is there has been a movement, a right-wing movement started by the Heritage Foundation and a number other of right-wing movements that back in January, about 5 days after the insurrection, the attempted insurrection at the Capitol, right? There was an actual think tank held by the Heritage Foundation, hosted by the Heritage Foundation, and a panel discussion, and it was called "The Grip on America." What they came to find out is that if we can curate the thought process of critical race theory, what they understood was a niche subject, right? And if we can curate that, the thought process behind it, then we can actually determine, or we can let people feel like, hey, you know what? Critical race theory involves my particular school. So I'm going to get even more basic, but I wanted to read a specific quote. Christopher F. Rufo, excuse me. He's considered the chair of Heritage Foundation and also the Manhattan Institute, right? Both are right-wing think tanks. Christopher Rufo, back in March 15, 2021, he said, "We have successfully frozen their brand of critical race theory into a public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it into a toxic as we put all various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of all cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans."
So basically what you're telling me is the political upheaval we're seeing in reference to critical race theory began by the Heritage Foundation after the insurrection. They had a meeting together.
5 days after the insurrection, they decided we needed to pick just put more plainly, a talking point that is going to galvanize the right-wing base and make people look at race and think like, oh, anything associated with critical race theory
is a negative.
Yeah, anything involving race is critical race theory, and anything involving critical race theory is a negative. And that is what is happening right now. And so when you hear people talk about, I didn't even know critical race theory is a thing, of course you wouldn't, because although it's been around for 40 plus years, it was never a discussion topic. Only 0.8% of the country has even studied critical race theory to a point where they can even teach it. Right. And so what you're finding, and you see it along a lot of forums, and you see these videos of these parents at school board meetings. I don't want it in my school. And then they wanted to teach. One parent said, oh, they were talking about the George Floyd protests. And they made my daughter write about George Floyd protests in her English class. I don't want critical race theory. Critical race theory is not, having given a conversation on the George Floyd protests, right? That is not. But what it is a conversation concerning race. But what they want is to curate the idea that people, anytime race is brought up in schools, it is
CRT.
It's CRT, and that is what's confusing people to the point where even you hear statements saying, "Oh." The 1619 Project, right? So the 1619 Project, which evaluated a multitude of different essays from different writers and historians, and it came from the purview of slaves who arrived on the shores of America in 1619 and how they viewed America. And what we know about history is, being actually a history major, history is done by the winners, right? And history is done by perspective, right? And so oftentimes our history is skewed but the winner goes the spoils. And so the 1619 Project was designed to evaluate history through a different lens, okay? That is not critical race theory. It was just evaluation of history. Now, those who are against critical race theory, it's not accurate, and we could have those conversations, but what I'm trying to really get to the point of is that critical race theory is not something that what everybody thinks it is. It's just a very specific field that has been codified and into a idea that race in schools should not be discussed. Here's the issue, and I'm sorry, I know you probably have another question.
Go, man.
Yeah. So the issue with a lot of these politicians creating ambiguous laws, and you being a lawyer, you know the issue when you create ambiguous law. It's like now you let the devil in, right? Because the devil's in the details, right? But if you don't have any other details, you just kind of say we don't want critical race theory in taught in our schools. Now you can have people with who are nefarious be like, all right, kid, now we know critical race theory is not in our schools, but now we can make sure we can curate what exactly is critical race theory under the guise of we don't want critical race theory because it hasn't been clearly defined. That means evaluation of history, right? And then that means curating the idea of history. And I just said history is written from a perspective, and to the victor goes the spoils. This is important because we actually have curriculum within the United States that look at slavery as, for one particular state in Texas, actually have textbooks that had slaves listed as workers, right? We have Juneteenth it's just been unanimously voted in on, right? And obviously, those who don't know, Juneteenth was is a celebration of a holiday of when the Union general went into Galveston, Texas, and notified the slaves 2.5 years after Civil War Emancipation Proclamation that they're in fact free. Reason that's important because in Texas, before it was for years they had written, and they still written into textbooks that Texas, we didn't know that the Civil War was ended. We didn't know the Emancipation was ended. We were just operating, right? That is centering history on whiteness. But what we do know is that they in fact did know that the Civil War ended because we saw from 1863 to 1865, there were over 100 publications in Texas newspapers detailing the Emancipation Proclamation. And they actually, and the fact of the matter is the telegraph, that was the iPhone of the time, had told all the states within the Union that the Emancipation Proclamation had been enacted, and therefore the slavery has ended. Texas is trying to manufacture an ideal of what slavery was, and they're narrating their story on
what history is. But even a discussion about Juneteenth, even a discussion that you mentioned about, okay, when did Texas know that the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed? The argument is that, okay, just having a discussion on that is critical race theory, and so therefore we shouldn't even talk about it because critical race theory is bad.
That could be the statement because it's so ambiguous. They've left an ambiguous law about we don't want critical race theory in our schools. And like, what is critical race theory according to them? Because they didn't define it.
So let's talk about what it is. We gave a definition. We talked about its history. We talked about where it is studied. Those who are proponents of critical race theory, where do they say that it should be taught, where it should be discussed, where it should be analyzed?
There are those who say it shouldn't be taught, period, because they said it's divisive to America, right? But they're, even though there was like, oh, it shouldn't be taught in, first of all, number one, they're not even telling where it should be taught.
Not the opponents, the proponents, those who the scholars in critical race theory, the Derek Bells of our time. Where do they say it should be taught? Are they saying, hey, listen, yes, let's teach it through K through 12. Let's teach it.
No, they're not saying that. What they're saying is we should have a more honest conversation surrounding race, and race should not be something we avoid in the K through 12. But they're not proposing that it be taught in K through 12 because ideally, people who know or study critical race theory, there's only a handful of people around the country who actually have the capabilities of teaching it. So we don't want just anybody teaching calculus just because I took algebra.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that's literally the idea. Like you don't want people who are not studied in the discipline teaching something they have no business teaching.
Funny thing is, you and I are lawyers and we're still trying to grasp our minds around the whole concept of critical race theory.
Right.
So there's still studies that we need to do and understand.
I am not equipped to teach an entire class about critical race theory. And I have a master's and a law degree and a bachelor's in history. So that should give people an idea that we don't want just certain people teaching it. So therefore, it is not appropriate for it to be taught in K through 12. What is appropriate is just have an honest conversation concerning race in our society. But critical race theory is just not the concept of, is not just quote unquote race talk.
To make it personal, during the last 4 years when we've seen the different protests in regards to police violence, there have been things that have come to the forefront in terms of history that we did not know before. For example, talking about Tulsa, Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but
I did know about Tulsa.
Because you was a history major.
Right.
But that's something that's for me that's recently come to my understanding, probably within the past 4 or 5 years. But of course, that's not something that was taught.
But let's break that down, right? So we look at Tulsa, right? And so first of all, a lot of people didn't know about Tulsa until this TV show called The Watchmen put it on HBO. And people were like, wait a minute, is that a real thing? I'm like, of course it's a real thing. But more importantly, let's dissect that. Tulsa actually, a lot of Tulsas happen around the country. Of course, in Central Florida, we had the Ocoee Massacre.
Right.
But we're gonna go somewhere with this. Just let me lead it, right? So it didn't just stop with the destruction of the black community, right? It didn't just stop with this bombing the black community and taking away the resources and whatnot. They weren't even allowed to rebuild, and for a lot of these communities, and it's was obvious in Central Florida and around the country. Mm-hmm. When you look at the highway system in the United States, you can actually make an argument that they are, remnants of white supremacy. People are like, oh, Camara, now you're going out there. But a lot of times these freeways, specifically with Tulsa, these freeways were built right through the black community. Governments just go ahead and co-opted the land and said, all right, we're going to build a freeway right through here. Right? They didn't do it through certain affluent, rich neighborhoods. They did it through black communities, tore them out, ripped them apart, said we're going to go ahead, do eminent domain and take over this land and do a freeway because we need access here. If you look at virtually every freeway and highway that's been interstate, that's been designed, especially here in Central Florida, right? But all around the country, Tulsa being an example, that was co-opted by the government and they created a highway right through the heart of the Tulsa district, right? And so even when things were bombed, even when things were, decimated, right? I finally can say the word, right? And we're actually, and even in that sense, you can rebuild. But if you can't rebuild, if it's now been taken over by the government and they're going to decide, oh, okay, since you're eliminated, we're going to go ahead and take this property and go ahead and build a freeway system. Critical race theory would have looked at that back then, and even now when we were building the interstate system in the 50s and 60s, that, hey, listen, we are building highways and through ramshot right through black communities, and it's stopping their ability to gain wealth in society. Right? They can't build wealth if you're always taking their land away from them and their homes, because we said the government understood that home ownership was a key evaluation of wealth. Right? But if we're always taking away their homes and building roads right through them, and then you're saying, well, how come there's a wealth gap within the black community? Well, because our homes were always having to be picked up and moved. You look at what happened with the Native Americans back, during the Trail of Tears, right? Them being consistently moved from place to place until they were gone onto the reservations, right? Critical race theory, we looked at it and say, well, listen, there's a reason why now look at them, like a Native American community, by and large, is ransacked with poverty, with drug use and depression, and they're diminished to such a place that it's really only certain sectors of the country that has a high population of Native Americans. And then the poverty rate is exponential, right? So critical race theory said that, us relocating and taking away lands from people makes them not have the ability to continue to grow and foster a culture and to expand their economics of their community, right? So that's what we would have looked at back then. We would have looked at how society is interrelating with economics, with law, and even if it interplayed with culture.
You've made me think. Talking about Tulsa, you tied it into the highway system. To bring it even closer to home, I was watching the movie One Night in Miami, where we had Muhammad Ali, Sam Cooke, and how they had that wonderful hotel in Miami that all the famous black individuals would go to, and they talked about Liberty City and how it was a great place during that time. Yeah. And of course, what caused the destruction, what caused the destruction of Liberty City is I-95 coming
right through
the middle of Liberty City. Right. And so what you're saying, for example, now when we're talking about, hey, listen, we want to build our infrastructure, we want to have more rails and talk about high-speed rail here and even in Florida, and looking at that analysis, critical race theory is saying let's also consider the impact of the racial dynamic. What impact is it going to have on the black community? What impact is it going to have on the Hispanic community? What impact is it even going to have on maybe the poor white community in that particular area?
Zoning. Why are we zoning certain things for the decimation, destruction, and why are we allowing certain other communities to continue to build and grow and expand? That's what it would have looked. That's what critical race theory would have evaluated through a macro sense. Like, okay, well, you've greenlit projects over here, but this community has been allowed to flourish. Right. Why is that?
There may be a relation. I was thinking about today. I went riding on a new pathway called the Wekiva Pathway, and there's a new highway going, from like Mount Dora, and they're connecting it to I-4, the Wekiva Expressway.
Yeah.
And even when they were building the Wekiva Expressway, one of the biggest arguments people were having is, listen, you're going to be going through a major natural resource at that time.
Right.
And they were looking at, okay, what impact, I think they even do studies, what impact is this highway going to have on the natural resources there in the Wekiva Forest?
Right.
And are we saying now that critical race theory is also saying whatever you're doing, what impact is it going to have on the race?
First of all, critical race theory is a subset of a subject of critical studies. And there's critical studies of critical economics theory, right? There's critical, it looks at how economics or environmental study, critical environmental theory, right? So, or studies, and I forget the exact term of that. But what you just described is them looking at how our environmental focus, they take an environmental focus on how we operate in society and law. Critical race theory is just a subset of that, saying it's just taking and now interplaying race in that and say, how are we operating in society, and we're by looking through the lens of race. And that's all it is. That's literally what it is. And we would have probably, I'm not saying it's going to stop things, right? Right? I'm not going to say it would have stopped us from building up the highways, but it would allow us to do a pause and consider, okay, well, maybe we don't need every single black community. We're sitting here doing a freeway. We're not going to rip through Liberty City and then allow this particular area to kind of flourish, and so that's just all it is.
One of the things that critical race theory says is that race is a social construct, right? And so to me, in my study of race, when we look around at the 1619 period, is when really race came into play, where we have this is the black race and this is the white race. And before then, most people were known by, okay, well, where are you from? What is your culture? Now, since race is essentially made up, is it helpful to continue to propagate that racial element, or should we be trying to take race out of the question altogether, since it was made up anyway? Should we deconstruct it out of our system?
Race is never going to be taken away from the initial fabric of this country, because the way we designed this country was on the basis of race. So for us to say now all of a sudden we want to live in a colorblind society is really disingenuous, right? And so that's really what they're saying, like, oh, we should live in a colorblind society. But when we're living in a colorblind society, we're taking away from the specifics of that particular culture, and it doesn't enhance their experience. It actually devalues it, right? Because it says that your experience is not as important as our togetherness, and that's not great. So let's take something like the Latinx community, right? There are subsets of the Latinx community, right? There are those who are in Central America. There are those in South America. So, and within South America and Central America, they have their individual capacity of cultures, right? They're not all yes, there are similarities, but there are things that are different within the subtext of those particular cultures. If we look at a colorblind society, we might say, but it doesn't matter if you're from Mexico or you're from Bolivia. Y'all are all the same, and we're all the same, and your cultures are all interrelated, right? And so, even to the point of our history start becoming mixed in a colorblindness, because now we understand that, just like, again, we talk about Central America and South America, we understand that, the Incas and the Mecca, we might say, oh, they're both the same, both ancient civilizations that have brown people, right? But their histories are all culturally indistinctive, right? And so we have to really be careful about wanting to say, oh, let's take away society and take away race as a society. Even in our best case scenario that race is a social construct, the evaluation of race is a social construct, because our race or our biology is all individualized. You know what I mean? And that is okay. It's the evaluation of how we compare races for one being better than the other. That needs to be eliminated.
We've often heard black is not a color, it's a culture. Have you heard that before?
No, but I can see that.
Okay. Wouldn't it be beneficial to, instead of focusing on the color, nowadays focus on the culture, and also understand that, you know, within America, there are many cultures, and there's an American culture that even delves into our Latin culture, or the African American culture, or the Italian culture, or the French culture. Is that a better analysis? And I know that's a tough question, than to focus on race.
I don't understand the concept of say black. You're saying take black out of the.
I'm saying
the evaluation of culture.
Not take it out of, but focus more on the culture than on this particular race, right?
Okay, so let's just, we just mentioned Latin America, right? Latinx. There's a real thing in Latin America called colorism.
Yes.
Okay.
In the Heights, it's a big argument about
right.
In the Heights.
Colorism is something that applies directly to Latin America. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that there is a large consortium of black people in Central and South America and South America, right? Dark skin. But the way colorism has perpetuated within that society, that is often forgotten. And so when people think of Latinx, they don't think of dark-skinned, Latinos. They think of just a certain pedigree, those who resemble from their Portuguese or their Spaniard heritage, right? Not from those who came from actually Africa. What a lot of people don't realize that 600,000 slaves were actually in Central America alone. There were over 2 million slaves in Brazil. Yeah. Imported into Brazil. So, I mean, those are just 2 countries.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I didn't even talk about every other country in Central and South America. So, but we don't have those conversations. And, if we eliminate the concept of black, then we're eliminating the fact of what happens with their culture and how they've been regulated in those particular societies, right? And so we have to be careful about saying that we don't want to include the term black within when evaluating culture, because black culture within those subsectors of society operated differently because they had to, because of the way society was constructed against them.
Man, listen, I appreciate the discussion. So good to have you on, Camara. And one of the things that I want to take away is that when we talk about color, when we talk about race, I think we have to talk about it because from a historical standpoint, those were major issues. And to take that out of the conversation is to not do a true justice to history. Yeah. And hopefully we can learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past and not make those same mistakes in the future. So again, Camara, thank you so much for coming on, and I appreciate it.
I hope I was decent enough for y'all, man.
Oh man, you threw some serious nuggets in there that I'm gonna invite my listeners to go back and look at. So again, thank you again, Camara, for coming on, and we look forward to seeing you guys again on our next episode of Law Matters. Again, I want to invite you to like us on Facebook and also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we're also on Spotify as well as iTunes. Peace.